The small village church was silent, save for the muffled sobs of a few mourners. Amelia's coffin lay at the center of the room, her pale face serene under the candlelight. The villagers had gathered to say their final goodbyes, but one presence stood out among them: a wolf, standing tall and unwavering at the foot of the coffin. Its golden eyes glowed with an intensity that made the villagers uneasy. No one knew where the wolf had come from, but it had been there since the moment Amelia's body was brought in. The priest cleared his throat, trying to ignore the animal as he began the eulogy. Amelia was a kind soul, taken from us too soon. Her struggles with illness were great, but her spirit was greater. We gather here today to honor her memory and— A low growl interrupted him. The wolf's ears twitched, and its gaze shifted to the coffin. It stepped closer, its nose brushing against the wood. The villagers exchanged nervous glances. Some whispered that the wolf was a bad omen, while others wondered if it was Amelia's spirit refusing to leave this world. David, Amelia's fiancé, stepped forward. His eyes were red from crying, but he approached the wolf cautiously. "Panther," he whispered, recognizing the animal. Panther was no ordinary wolf. Amelia had found him injured in the woods years ago and nursed him back to health. Since then, the two had been inseparable. David reached out to touch Panther's fur, but the wolf snarled, baring its teeth. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. "Something's wrong," David muttered, his heart pounding. He looked at Amelia's lifeless face, then back at the wolf. Panther pawed at the coffin, his claws scraping against the wood. The villagers gasped, and the priest stepped back, clutching his Bible. "David, control that beast," someone shouted. But David didn't move. He stared at Panther, his mind racing. The wolf had never acted like this before. There was something desperate in its eyes, something urgent. And then it hit him. What if Amelia wasn't really dead? David's heart raced as he leaned closer to the coffin, his eyes scanning Amelia's face for any sign of life. Her skin was cold, her chest still. The doctor had declared her dead just hours ago after she collapsed during one of her epileptic episodes. The village had no advanced medical equipment, and the doctor, though well-meaning, had relied on the absence of a pulse and breath to confirm her passing. But now, with Panther's strange behavior, doubt crept into David's mind. "Doctor," David called out, his voice trembling, "please check her again." The doctor, an elderly man with a kind but weary face, stepped forward. "David, I understand your grief, but I assure you, Amelia is gone. Her condition, it was too severe. The catalepsy made it seem like she was still with us, but she's at peace now." Panther growled again, louder this time, and the sound echoed through the church. The wolf's eyes never left Amelia's face, and its body was tense, as if ready to spring into action. David clenched his fists, torn between reason and the desperate hope that Panther was trying to tell him something. "Please," David pleaded, his voice breaking. "Just check her one more time, for me." The doctor hesitated, then sighed. He approached the coffin and placed his fingers on Amelia's wrist, feeling for a pulse. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on the doctor's face. After a long moment, he shook his head. "I'm sorry, David, there's nothing." But Panther wasn't convinced. The wolf let out a sharp, piercing howl that sent shivers down everyone's spines. It was a sound of anguish, of defiance. Then, without warning, Panther lunged at the coffin, his powerful body knocking it sideways. The lid shifted and Amelia's arm slipped out, dangling limply. "Stop that beast," someone shouted, but David held up a hand. "Wait!" he cried, his eyes locked on Amelia's arm. For a moment he thought he saw her fingers twitch. His breath caught in his throat. "Doctor, look! Her hand! Did you see that?" The doctor frowned, stepping closer. He took Amelia's hand in his, feeling for a pulse once more. This time his eyes widened. I think I feel something. It's faint, but it's there." The room erupted into chaos. Villagers gasped and whispered, some crossing themselves in fear or awe. David's heart soared, but his relief was short-lived. If Amelia was still alive, she was in grave danger. Every second counted. "We need to get her to the hospital now," David shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. He turned to Panther, who was still standing guard over the coffin, his body tense and ready. "You were right, boy. You knew all along, didn't you?" Panther's eyes met David's, and for a moment it felt as if the wolf understood every word. The bond between Amelia and Panther was something no one could explain. But in that moment, David knew the wolf had saved her life. The church doors burst open as David and a few villagers carried Amelia's limp body out into the cold night. Panther followed closely, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness as if on high alert. The nearest hospital was miles away, and the village had no vehicles. The only option was to carry her on a makeshift stretcher and hope they could make it in time. "Hurry," David urged, his voice strained with desperation. He gripped one end of the stretcher, his hands trembling as he tried to steady himself. Amelia's face was pale, her breathing shallow. The doctor ran alongside them, holding her wrist and monitoring her faint pulse. Panther darted ahead, his powerful legs carrying him swiftly through the forest path. He stopped every few moments, looking back as if to ensure they were following. The villagers whispered among themselves, some still fearful of the wolf, but none dared to question his actions now. Panther had proven himself more than just an animal. He was a guardian, a protector. As they moved deeper into the forest, the path grew darker and more treacherous. The trees loomed overhead, their branches casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. David's heart pounded in his chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. He couldn't lose Amelia, not like this. Not after everything they had been through. "David," the doctor panted, struggling to keep up. "Her pulse is getting weaker. We need to move faster." David nodded, his jaw clenched. He called out to Panther, who was now a shadow in the distance. "Panther, lead the way. We're right behind you." The wolf let out a low howl, a sound that seemed to echo through the forest. It was a call to action, a reminder that time was running out. Panther surged forward, his instincts guiding him through the maze of trees and underbrush. The villagers followed as best they could, their lanterns casting flickering light on the path. Minutes felt like hours as they pushed forward, every second a battle against exhaustion and fear. David's arms ached, but he refused to stop. He kept his eyes on Amelia, her face still and peaceful as if she were merely sleeping. He whispered to her, his voice barely audible over the sound of their hurried footsteps. "Hold on, Amelia. Please, just hold on. We're almost there." Panther suddenly stopped ahead, his body tense. The villagers slowed, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Before them was a narrow river, its waters rushing swiftly under the moonlight. The hospital was on the other side, but the bridge was old and unstable, its wooden planks creaking in the wind. "We have to cross," David said, his voice firm. "There's no other way." The villagers hesitated, their fear of the bridge evident. But Panther stepped forward, his eyes locked on the other side. He let out a soft whine as if urging them to follow. David took a deep breath and stepped onto the bridge, the stretcher balanced carefully in his hands. One by one, the villagers followed, their steps cautious and deliberate. The bridge groaned under their weight, but it held. Panther stayed close to David, his presence a source of strength and reassurance. As they reached the other side, the hospital came into view, its lights a beacon of hope in the darkness. "We're almost there," David whispered, his voice filled with determination. "Just a little further, Amelia. Stay with me." Panther let out a triumphant howl, his voice carrying through the night. It was a sound of hope, of defiance against the odds. The wolf had led them this far, and David knew they couldn't give up now. The hospital doors slammed open as David and the villagers rushed in, carrying Amelia's fragile body. Nurses and doctors immediately sprang into action, their trained eyes assessing the situation. Panther tried to follow, but a nurse blocked his path, her expression a mix of fear and confusion. "You can't bring a wolf in here," she exclaimed, her voice sharp. David turned, his face desperate. "Please, he's not just a wolf. He's the reason we realize she's still alive. He saved her." The nurse hesitated, glancing at Panther, who stood tall and unwavering, his golden eyes fixed on Amelia. Finally, she stepped aside. "Fine, but keep him under control." Panther followed closely as the medical team wheeled Amelia into an emergency room. David stayed by her side, his hand gripping hers tightly. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. "You have to be." The doctors worked quickly, hooking Amelia up to machines and monitoring her vital signs. Panther sat in the corner of the room, his eyes never leaving Amelia. His presence was calm but intense, as if he were silently willing her to wake up. Hours passed, and the tension in the room grew unbearable. David paced back and forth, his mind racing with fear and hope. The doctor who had accompanied them from the village approached, his face grim. "David," he said softly, "we need to talk." David's heart sank. "What is it? Is she—" The doctor shook his head. "She's stable for now, but her condition is complicated. The catalepsy. It's a rare condition that mimics death. Her body shuts down to the point where it's nearly impossible to detect signs of life without advanced equipment. If it weren't for the wolf, we might have buried her alive." David's knees nearly gave out at the thought. He glanced at Panther, who was still watching Amelia intently. "Thank you," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if the wolf could understand. "Thank you for saving her." The doctor continued, his voice low. "There's more. Amelia's epilepsy has worsened. The seizures are becoming more frequent and severe. If we don't find a way to manage it, she might not survive the next episode." David's chest tightened. "What can we do?" "There's a specialist in the city," the doctor explained. "He's one of the best in treating conditions like Amelia's, but it's a long journey and it won't be easy." David nodded without hesitation. "I'll do whatever it takes. She's fought so hard to survive. I won't let her down now." As the doctor left to make arrangements, David sat by Amelia's bedside, his hand still holding hers. Panther moved closer, resting his head on the edge of the bed. David reached out to stroke the wolf's fur, finding comfort in his presence. "We're not giving up," David said, his voice firm. "Not now, not ever." Panther let out a soft whine, his eyes never leaving Amelia's face. It was as if he understood every word, every emotion. The bond between them was unbreakable, a testament to the power of love and loyalty. The next morning, David and Panther prepared for the journey to the city. Amelia was still unconscious, but her condition had stabilized enough for transport. The hospital provided a small van for the trip, and David carefully secured Amelia in the back, making sure she was as comfortable as possible. Panther sat beside her, his watchful eyes never leaving her face. The road to the city was long and winding, cutting through dense forests and rolling hills. David drove carefully, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Every bump in the road made him wince, fearing it might worsen Amelia's condition. Panther remained calm, his presence a steadying force in the tense atmosphere. As they drove, David found himself reflecting on the past. He remembered the day Amelia had found Panther in the woods, injured and alone. She had nursed him back to health, and from that day on, the wolf had become her constant companion. David had always admired the bond between them, but now he understood just how deep it ran. Panther wasn't just a pet, he was family. Hours passed, and the landscape began to change. The dense forests gave way to open fields, and eventually the city skyline came into view. Tall buildings loomed in the distance, their glass windows reflecting the sunlight. David felt a mix of hope and anxiety as they approached. This was their best chance to save Amelia, but it was also uncharted territory. They arrived at the city hospital, a sprawling complex of modern buildings and bustling activity. David parked the van and hurried to the back, where Panther was still guarding Amelia. A team of medical professionals was already waiting, having been alerted to their arrival. They quickly transferred Amelia to a stretcher and wheeled her inside. David tried to follow, but a security guard stopped him. "I'm sorry, sir, but animals aren't allowed inside." David's heart sank. He looked at Panther, who was staring at him with those intense golden eyes. "He's not just an animal," David said, his voice pleading. "He's her protector. He saved her life." The guard hesitated, but the rules were clear. "I'm sorry, but I can't let him in." David nodded reluctantly. He knelt beside Panther, placing a hand on the wolf's head. "Stay here, boy. I'll be back as soon as I can. Watch over her, okay?" Panther let out a soft whine but remained seated, his eyes following David as he entered the hospital. The wolf's loyalty was unwavering, even in the face of separation. Inside, David was directed to a waiting room. The minutes felt like hours as he sat there, his mind racing with worry. He couldn't shake the image of Amelia's pale face or the thought of Panther waiting outside, alone and anxious. Finally, a doctor entered the room. He was a tall man with a kind face and a calm demeanor. "Mr. David?" he asked. David stood up quickly. "Yes, that's me. How is she?" The doctor smiled reassuringly. "Amelia is stable, and we've started her on a new treatment plan. Her condition is rare but not untreatable. With the right care, she has a good chance of recovery." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you so much." The doctor nodded. "We'll keep her under observation for a few days, but you're welcome to stay with her. She's a fighter, and she's lucky to have someone like you by her side." David thought of Panther waiting outside and felt a pang of guilt. "There's someone else who deserves credit," he said. "Her wolf, Panther. He's the one who saved her." The doctor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A wolf, you say? That's remarkable. Animals have instincts we can't always explain. Perhaps he sensed something we couldn't." David nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "He's more than just an animal. He's family." Over the next few days, David rarely left Amelia's side. He slept in a chair by her hospital bed, holding her hand and talking to her softly, hoping his voice would reach her wherever she was. Panther waited outside the hospital, patiently guarding the entrance. Hospital staff and visitors soon grew accustomed to the wolf's presence, and some even brought him food and water, moved by his loyalty. On the third day, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, something miraculous happened. David was dozing in his chair when he felt a faint squeeze on his hand. His eyes snapped open, and he looked down to see Amelia's fingers twitching. His heart leaped into his throat. "Amelia," he whispered, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, and after a moment they slowly opened. Her gaze was unfocused at first, but then it settled on David's face. A weak smile tugged at her lips. "David," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Tears streamed down David's face as he squeezed her hand. "You're awake. Oh, Amelia, you're awake." The nurses rushed in, alerted by the monitors, and quickly checked Amelia's vitals. She was weak but responsive, and her condition had improved significantly. The doctor who had been treating her arrived shortly after, a look of relief on his face. "This is a remarkable recovery," he said, examining her charts. "She's not out of the woods yet, but this is a very good sign." David couldn't stop smiling. He leaned down and kissed Amelia's forehead. "You did it," he whispered. "You came back to me." Amelia's eyes searched the room, a faint frown creasing her brow. "Where's Panther?" she asked, her voice still weak but filled with concern. David's heart ached. He had been so focused on Amelia that he hadn't thought about how to explain Panther's absence. "He's outside," he said gently. "He's been waiting for you this whole time. He's the one who saved you, Amelia. He never gave up on you." Tears welled up in Amelia's eyes. "I need to see him," she said, her voice trembling. David hesitated. "The hospital won't allow him inside, but I'll figure something out." "I promise." The next day, David approached the hospital staff with a request. He explained Panther's role in saving Amelia's life and begged them to make an exception. After some discussion, they agreed to let Panther visit Amelia in a secluded courtyard, away from other patients. When David brought Panther to the courtyard, Amelia was already there, sitting in a wheelchair with a blanket draped over her shoulders. Her face lit up when she saw the wolf, and she reached out a shaky hand. "Panther," she whispered. The wolf bounded over to her, his tail wagging furiously. He nuzzled her hand and rested his head on her lap, his golden eyes filled with affection. Amelia buried her fingers in his fur, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for never leaving me." Panther let out a soft whine, as if to say he would never abandon her. David stood nearby, his heart swelling with emotion. The bond between Amelia and Panther was something extraordinary, a testament to the power of love and loyalty. As the days passed, Amelia grew stronger. The new treatment plan was working, and her seizures became less frequent. Panther visited her every day, and the hospital staff grew fond of the wolf, often joking that he was their most dedicated patient. Weeks turned into months, and Amelia's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. The city hospital had given her a second chance at life, and Panther had been by her side every step of the way. David, too, had never left her, his love and devotion unwavering. The three of them had become a family bound by an unbreakable bond. One crisp morning, as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, David and Amelia stood in the courtyard of the hospital. Amelia was no longer in a wheelchair. She stood on her own, her strength returning day by day. Panther sat beside her, his tail swishing gently as he watched the world wake up around them. David took Amelia's hand in his heart pounding with nervous excitement. "Amelia," he began, his voice soft but steady. "We've been through so much together. You've fought harder than anyone I know, and Panther, well, he's shown us what true loyalty looks like." Amelia smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "David, what are you saying?" He dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a simple yet elegant ring, its diamond catching the sunlight. "Amelia, will you marry me? Not in a church filled with mourners, but in a place filled with life and hope? Will you let me spend the rest of my life by your side, with Panther as our witness?" Amelia's hands flew to her mouth, her tears spilling over. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, David. 1,000 times yes." David slipped the ring onto her finger, his own eyes wet with tears. He stood and pulled her into a gentle embrace, their hearts beating as one. Panther let out a joyful howl, his tail wagging furiously as if he understood the significance of the moment. The wedding was a small, intimate affair held in the village square, surrounded by the people who had supported them through their darkest days. Amelia wore a simple white dress, her cheeks glowing with health and happiness. David stood beside her, his eyes never leaving her face, and Panther, the wolf who had refused to give up on her, sat proudly at their feet, his golden eyes shining with pride. As they exchanged vows, the villagers watched in awe, their hearts touched by the story of love, loyalty, and survival. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, the square erupted into cheers and applause. But the loudest sound of all was Panther's triumphant howl, a sound that echoed through the village and into the hearts of everyone who heard it. In the years that followed, David and Amelia built a life filled with love and joy. They often took long walks through the forest, with Panther leading the way, his nose sniffing the air for signs of adventure. Amelia's health continued to improve, and though she still had occasional seizures, they were manageable, thanks to the treatment she had received in the city. Panther remained a constant presence in their lives, a reminder of the miraculous bond between humans and animals. He was more than just a pet. He was a hero, a guardian, and a symbol of hope. And so, the story of the woman who was saved by a wolf became legend in the village, a tale of love, loyalty, and the power of never giving up. It was a story that would be told for generations, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always a glimmer of light. And sometimes, that light comes in the form of a loyal wolf with golden eyes.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.